Not long after Mzee Baraka's departure, misfortune descended upon the village like a dark cloud. It began subtly at first, a strange chill in the air, a change in the usual rhythms of life. Then, one morning, farmers awoke to find their crops withered. The cornfields, once golden and ripe, had turned gray and brittle overnight. The river, which had always been a source of life and abundance, grew stagnant. Its once clear waters now ran murky, emitting a foul odor that kept even the animals away. Livestock fell ill, their cries echoing through the village like mournful laments. The villagers were struck by fear and confusion. They gathered at the marketplace, their faces pale with worry, as the elders debated what could be done. "This is no ordinary misfortune," said Elder Kvesi, his voice trembling with age and anxiety. "The ancestors are displeased." "But why?" a young farmer asked. "We have made sacrifices at the shrine. We have prayed. Why would they punish us?" The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Though none spoke it aloud, they all knew the likely answer: Mzee Baraka. In the royal palace, King Oba Ajani was not spared from the calamity. His grand gardens, once filled with vibrant flowers and fruit-bearing trees, had withered just like the villagers' fields. The royal cattle, prized for their size and strength, lay sick in their pens. As he paced the halls of his mansion, his frustration boiled over. "This cannot be happening," he roared, slamming his staff against the floor. "Where are the priests? Where are the healers? I demand answers." His advisors stood in silence, afraid to meet his eyes. Finally, one of the bolder elders spoke. "My king," the elder said cautiously, "the people believe that the absence of Mzee Baraka has brought this plague upon us." Oba Ajani's face darkened. "Nonsense." The old man was nothing more than a storyteller and a herbalist. He had no power to affect the will of the ancestors. "Perhaps," the elder replied, lowering his voice, "but the people saw him as a bridge to the ancestors. His wisdom kept the balance in our village. Without him." The king cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Enough. I will not hear more of this. Find another explanation." As the days turned into weeks, the plague only worsened. Children fell ill with strange fevers, and their parents could do little but watch helplessly. The village's once bustling marketplace grew quiet, as there was little to trade or sell. Even the animals that had survived the initial sickness now avoided the humans, as if sensing the air of despair. The villagers began to whisper amongst themselves. "We were foolish to let the king drive him away," said one woman as she knelt beside her dying goat. "Mzee Baraka's wisdom was our protection. Without him," another man added, "we are lost. The ancestors will not hear us." Their words spread quickly, fueling a growing sense of unrest. Desperation drove the villagers to the shrine of the ancestors, a sacred place at the edge of the village marked by a circle of ancient stones. There, they lit fires and offered sacrifices, goats, chickens, even bundles of their most precious crops. They prayed day and night, their voices rising in mournful chants: "Great spirits, forgive us, show us mercy, guide us out of this darkness." But the skies remained heavy with clouds, and the air stayed thick with despair. The plague did not relent. Meanwhile, strange visions began to haunt the villagers. At night, as they lay in their huts, they saw fleeting images of Mzee Baraka's face in the stars. His eyes seemed to gaze down at them, filled with sorrow. His voice whispered through the wind, soft but unmistakable: "Balance must be restored." The visions sparked both hope and guilt among the villagers. Adia, the bold young woman, who had spoken out before, was the first to voice what many were thinking. "The ancestors are showing us the way," she said to a gathering of villagers. "They are telling us that we need Mzee Baraka to return. He is the key to ending this plague." "But how can we bring him back?" an elder asked. "The king has banished him. Anyone who defies that decree will face punishment." Adia's jaw tightened. "Then we must decide, what is more important, our fear of the king, or the survival of our village?" In the palace, King Oba Ajani began to feel the weight of his decisions. Though he refused to admit it, he could not ignore the whispers of his advisors, or the pleas of the villagers who dared approach him. "My king," one of his most trusted advisors said one evening, "perhaps we should consider seeking Mzee Baraka's guidance." The people believe in his wisdom. If bringing him back will restore order, is it not worth swallowing our pride? The king's face hardened. You suggest that I, a king, admit to needing a poor old man. Do you realize what that would mean for my authority? It would mean that you care for your people above all else, the advisor replied quietly. Oba Ajani dismissed him with a wave, but the words lingered in his mind. As the village descended further into chaos, a quiet but powerful resolve began to form among the people. They knew that waiting for the king to act would only lead to more suffering. One night, under the cover of darkness, a small group of villagers gathered at the edge of the village. Among them were Adia, Elder Kvesi, and a handful of others who had long respected Mzee Baraka's wisdom. We will find him, Adia declared, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. And we will bring him back, for the sake of our children, our ancestors, and our future. The group set out into the night, their footsteps guided by hope and desperation. The night was quiet as the group of villagers set out to find Mzee Baraka. Adia led the way, her determined expression lit by the flickering light of the torch she carried. Elder Kvesi walked beside her, his staff tapping softly against the ground. Behind them, the others followed, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. We don't even know where he went, muttered one of the younger men. Adia glanced back, her voice firm. He cannot have gone far. A man like Mzee Baraka would stay near a place where he could hear the whispers of the ancestors. Trust me, we'll find him. The group traveled through the night, the landscape around them shifting from the familiar fields and forests of their village to untamed wilderness. The path grew more difficult as they ventured deeper into the unknown. Thorny bushes scratched at their legs, and the calls of nocturnal animals echoed in the darkness. Elder Kvesi paused to catch his breath, leaning heavily on his staff. Adia, are you sure about this? If the king discovers what we're doing, there will be consequences. Adia turned to him, her eyes blazing with resolve. The king may rule over us, but the ancestors watch over us. If we let fear stop us, what kind of future will we have? Mzee Baraka must return. Kvesi nodded, impressed by her courage. You have the spirit of a leader, child. May the ancestors guide our steps. As dawn began to break, they came upon a small clearing surrounded by towering baobab trees. In the center of the clearing was a modest hut, its walls made of woven branches, and its roof thatched with dried grass. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, curling into the morning sky. This must be it, Adia whispered, her heart quickening. The group approached cautiously, unsure of what they would find. As they neared the hut, the door creaked open, and there he stood, Mzee Baraka. The old man's silver-gray hair glistened in the early sunlight, and his weathered face broke into a gentle smile as he recognized the villagers. He leaned on his wooden staff, his eyes scanning their faces with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. Adia, he said, his voice calm but filled with wisdom. Elder Kvesi, what brings you here, so far from home? Adia stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. Mzee Baraka, the village is in trouble. A plague has struck, and we believe the ancestors are punishing us for your banishment. Crops are failing, livestock are dying, and the people are falling ill. We need your wisdom to save us. Mzee Baraka's expression grew serious, and he lowered his gaze. I warned the king that imbalance would come if harmony was broken, but he did not listen. Now the village suffers. Please, Elder Kvesi added. We know the king's actions were unjust, but the people, your people, are suffering. They need you, Mzee Baraka. We all do. The old man sighed deeply, the weight of the villagers' plight heavy on his heart. He turned and gestured for them to enter his hut. Inside, the space was small but orderly, with shelves lined with bundles of herbs, carved figurines, and other tools of his trade. Mzee Baraka lit a small fire in the hearth and motioned for the villagers to sit. Tell me everything, he said. Adia and the others recounted the events that had unfolded since his banishment, the failing crops, the stagnant river, the dying livestock, and the growing despair among the people. As they spoke, Mzee Baraka listened intently, his eyes distant as if he were communing with unseen forces. When they finished, he closed his eyes and began to hum a low, melodic tune. The sound was soothing, almost hypnotic, and the villagers felt a sense of calm wash over them. After a long moment, Mzee Baraka opened his eyes. "The ancestors are indeed displeased," he said. "Balance has been broken, not only in the village but in the hearts of its people. Greed and pride have taken root where humility and unity once flourished. To restore harmony, sacrifices must be made, not of livestock or crops, but of ego and mistrust." Adia frowned. "What do you mean, sacrifices? What must we do?" Mzee Baraka stood and walked to a small altar at the back of the hut. He picked up a bundle of herbs and a carved wooden bowl, then turned to face them. "To cleanse the village, I will need to invoke the spirits of our ancestors. But their blessings will not come unless the people are willing to change. The king must acknowledge his wrongdoing, and the people must forgive him." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. "The king will never admit he was wrong," Kvesi said grimly. "His pride will not allow it." "Then the suffering will continue," Mzee Baraka said simply. Adia stood, her jaw set with determination. "We will do whatever it takes to bring you back to the village. Even if the king refuses to admit his faults, the people need to see you again. They need hope." Mzee Baraka studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, I will return. But know this, the journey ahead will not be easy. To heal the village, we must first heal its spirit, and that will require more courage than you can imagine." As the group prepared to leave, Mzee Baraka gathered his tools and herbs, packing them carefully into a woven bag. Before they departed, he stepped outside and looked up at the sky, his expression thoughtful. "The ancestors have guided you to me," he said. "Now let us see if they will guide us home." With that, they began the journey back to the village, their hearts filled with both hope and trepidation. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Mzee Baraka's wisdom would once again be their beacon in the darkness. The return journey to the village was filled with an air of urgency. Mzee Baraka walked at the center of the group, his wooden staff tapping rhythmically against the dusty path. Adia stayed close by his side, her torch held high even as daylight brightened the sky. Behind them, the rest of the group trudged along, their faces etched with exhaustion but also renewed hope. As they walked, Mzee Baraka seemed lost in thought, his silver-gray hair glinting in the sunlight. The villagers exchanged whispered conversations, their voices barely audible over the rustling of the trees. "Do you think he can truly end the plague?" a young man asked Elder Kvesi. The elder glanced at Mzee Baraka and nodded. "If anyone can, it's him. His wisdom is a gift from the ancestors. We must trust him." When they reached the outskirts of the village, a strange stillness greeted them. The once thriving marketplace was eerily empty, and the air carried a faint, sour odor of decay. Houses stood silent, their doors shut tightly as though the villagers were hiding from the calamity that had befallen them. Adia looked around, her chest tightening. "It's worse than when we left," she whispered. Mzee Baraka paused, his gaze sweeping over the desolate scene. He placed a hand on Adia's shoulder. "The spirit of the village is broken, but it is not beyond repair. Take me to the river." The group led Mzee Baraka to the village river, the lifeblood of their community. Once clear and sparkling, its waters now ran dark and stagnant, a sickly green hue coating its surface. Dead fish floated aimlessly, and the surrounding vegetation had begun to wilt. Mzee Baraka knelt by the riverbank, his expression grave. He dipped his fingers into the murky water, then brought them to his nose, sniffing gently. He closed his eyes, murmuring an incantation in a language only the spirits would understand. "The river is poisoned," he said, rising to his feet. "But the poison is not natural, it is a manifestation of the discord in the village. The ancestors are angry, and their wrath has tainted the land." Word of Mzee Baraka's return spread quickly, and soon a crowd began to gather near the river. The villagers, their faces hollow with despair, stared at him as though he were their last hope. One elderly woman stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mzee Baraka," she said, her voice trembling, "we prayed to the ancestors, but they did not answer. We are cursed. Can you save us?" Mzee Baraka turned to face the crowd, his voice calm but commanding. The ancestors have not abandoned you. They are watching, waiting for you to make things right. But healing cannot begin until the truth is brought to light. As his words hung in the air, a murmur spread through the crowd. The villagers began to whisper among themselves, their eyes darting toward the royal palace that loomed in the distance. Adia stepped forward, her voice ringing out clearly. We all know what must be done. The king's actions have brought this upon us. He banished Mzee Baraka out of jealousy, and now we are paying the price. It is time for the king to answer for his deeds. The crowd grew restless, their whispers turning into shouts of agreement. The king must answer, they cried. Bring him to the river. At that moment, the doors of the palace opened, and King Oba Ajani emerged, flanked by his guards. His face was a mask of anger and defiance, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. His wife, Queen Naya, followed closely behind, her expression cold and unyielding. What is the meaning of this? The king demanded, his voice booming across the riverbank. Why have you brought this banished man back into the village? The crowd parted, and Mzee Baraka stepped forward, his gaze meeting the king's. I have returned because your people called for me, he said simply. They are suffering, Oba Ajani, and the source of their suffering lies within your heart. The king's face darkened. You dare accuse me? I am the king. It is my duty to rule and protect this village. You have ruled, Mzee Baraka replied, his voice steady, but you have not protected. Your pride and jealousy have poisoned this land. Until you acknowledge your wrongdoing, the plague will not end. The villagers watched in tense silence as the two men faced off. Adia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. The people have spoken, Oba Ajani. We want Mzee Baraka to stay. If you truly care for this village, you will listen to him. The king's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might call his guards to action. But then a low rumble filled the air, like distant thunder. The crowd gasped as the river began to bubble, its stagnant waters churning violently. Mzee Baraka turned to the villagers, his voice rising above the commotion. The ancestors are watching. Their patience is wearing thin. If we do not act now, the plague will consume us all. The king's defiance faltered as the rumble grew louder, the ground beneath their feet trembling. He looked around, his expression shifting from anger to fear. Finally, he raised his hands, signaling for silence. Enough, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. What must I do to end this curse? Mzee Baraka stepped closer, his gaze piercing. You must confess your sins to the people. Acknowledge the harm you have caused, and seek their forgiveness. Only then will the ancestors grant us peace. The king hesitated, his pride warring with the undeniable truth. The villagers waited with bated breath, their fate hanging on his next words. At last, King Oba Ajani finally confessed that it was out of jealousy that he conspired with his wife the queen to banish Mzee Baraka. After the confession, the community dethroned King Oba Ajani, and made Mzee Baraka their king for his great wisdom.